Hello everyone. So this is something like my 5th or 6th time trying to start this video. I'm out of practice. It's summer. The lighting's doing something weird. I'm all over the place at the moment. I'm just going to do my best. As you can see from today's title, that I'm going to be talking about nightmares and the Morrígan. And more specifically, my experience with all manner of sort of nightmarish material. My own experience of things like night terrors, nightmares, and recurring nightmares. I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail. I don't want to scare everybody. But there is going to be some detail, so if people are potentially squeamish, you might not want to watch this video. If people are easily scared, you might not want to watch this video. I don't actually have a great sense of what scares other people. I know what scares me, and I know what type of scary material I can't go near because it just won't be a good idea. But obviously everybody else needs to kind of figure out where they're at with that and then like click off if you need to. Okay. So in general terms, the Morrígan is obviously often associated with nightmares. My understanding is that there's actually a pretty practical commonality among followers of the Morrígan, that they experience issues with nightmares or night terrors or recurring nightmares, etc., etc., etc. But you know, there is this commonality among followers of the Morrígan as far as I've just sort of anecdotally observed, and it does seem to be that in addition to finding comfort and being able to kind of interface with the realm of nightmares, followers of the Morrígan often also feel on a personal gnosis level like she helps them channel those experiences and make them into something potent that has, you know, personal self-agency in it. Obviously from a more textual standpoint, the Morrígan, the name, is sometimes understood to mean, you know, phantom queen. In my case also, Navan plays a huge role in my day-to-day. So one thing I do want to kind of express as part of this video is that even just this video alone is going to be a pretty small snapshot of like elements of my practice and engagement with the Morrígan. But the thing I want to stress that doesn't get represented as much on YouTube specifically is that huge amounts of my day-to-day are really rooted, like my witchcraft practice and so on, are really, really rooted in my religious devotional perspective around the mythological framework I operate in. The vast majority of everything I do, think about, etc., is channeled in some way or other through some lens or other in a Morrígan-esque direction. It's just very important to me that that gets threaded through absolutely everything. And it's something that's awkward to talk about on YouTube because of course it involves so much personal experience, so much personal gnosis. There's cultural sensitivities. I'm in a slightly precarious kind of situation given that I live in Ireland but I'm not Irish. There's a lot of that kind of stuff that I find it makes it quite awkward for me to talk about this online. So today is going to be an example of some of the things that are related to the topic at hand, but just with the understanding that there's a lot more to it that even being able to talk about it linearly is difficult. So YouTube is in some ways an excellent platform for talking about these things and sharing ideas, but it's also kind of rather inorganic. So as I was saying, Navan is a huge deal, especially in terms of things like dealing with terror, fear, the kind of poisoning effect that nightmares have. Her name linguistically is sometimes understood to relate to forms of like toxicity and poison. Báibh is a huge, huge deal. This winged figure in the sky, shape-shifting, the sort of foretelling and sort of vocal components of Báibh. All of these things, all of her different identities and aspects do interlink. It's very, very hard to parse them out in terms of nightmare and nightmarish experience. Okay. So in general terms, nightmares for me tend to be pretty formulaic and pretty repetitive. I've had more than my fair share of special nightmares, but I'm someone who tends to have nightmares very, very regularly. And there have been whole periods of my life where there, you know, I've gone long periods of time with only getting something like 3 hours sleep, maybe a night, because of recurring nightmares and night terrors and things. I'm currently at a slightly better place with that, and therefore my health is also doing a little bit better. But some of that, as you will see, is literally because I have done a lot of work to kind of understand what role these sorts of things play for me. So in general terms, recurring nightmares for me tend to be located in cityscapes and in crowded, often very neon lit evening or dusk environments. The darker the aspect of the nighttime, the more things like the orange or intensely blue glow of street lamp light starts to take on a really uncanny and absolutely terror-ridden quality in my nightmares. There's often a lot of running away from something, either an actual physical attacker or some unseen entity. And there's also often, although this is changing slightly at the moment, there is also often a recurring, increasingly bestial need to yell and then scream and then eventually have wordless screams such that I turn purple and red and blotched and my throat grows wider than my body and I become completely morphed into something horrific to behold and to be, with the emphasis being on extreme sound, extreme unhuman, inhuman, other than human, other than anything natural kind of sound. So those of you who know about Nevin and the whole like scream killing 100 warriors in a night kind of thing, this links into a lot of that sort of thing for me. It also links into these sorts of phenomena in my dreams, in my waking life, link into understandings in Iron Age and to some extent medieval Celtic warfare and the use of sound for purposes of intimidation and the sort of psychological impact of sound. There's also certain textual references around singing, especially singing in three voices singing in various harmonies. That plays into a lot of how I understand and talk to myself about these things and derive meaning from them and so on. So you get this very sort of uncanny cityscape, often very sort of almost Borgesian, interlocking components. The streets will often shift around me, often as I'm trying to run away from something. Sometimes that will shift so that the thing I'm running away from is now in front of me and I'm running towards it. There are a lot of abduction and kidnapping and murder narratives in my dreams, and I am not even someone who watches anything to do with true crime. So there's a reason I don't watch that stuff for many reasons, but that's one of them, is I'll be there when I'm asleep. I will be in that environment when I'm asleep. So there's these recurring motifs, right, that formulate the baseline, and it's to the point where if I don't wake up screaming or absolutely like cold sweats terrified, if I'm not jolted awake through sheer terror out of my dreams, I actually don't really qualify it as a nightmare anymore. The rubric has just had to shift. I have had the occasional experience with things like night terrors. I've also had experiences with what's it called? Sleep paralysis. Although that was a much more, like, there's one in particular that was a really, really strong experience, but it actually wasn't negative. I was just asleep and couldn't move, and something divine was happening that my body was part of. So anyway, point being, there's a lot of this kind of unbelievable sort of like, am I lucid dreaming? Am I not? Am I moving? Am I not? Do I have agency? Do I not? Recurring themes in my sleep in general terms. So now what I want to do is talk about, hopefully briefly, 3 different nightmares that I've had that have affected and changed the course of my pagan religious understanding and my witchcraft. I'm going to do my best to keep them succinct and comparatively scary, gore, and guts and detail free, but once again, there is a warning in general terms on this video. If you're someone who's squeamish, I would click away. If you're someone who's easily creeped out by mentioned by things like eyeballs and skin stretching and all sorts of really scary, weird things, I would click away. If Beksiński paintings scare you, I would click away, okay? Okay, so I'm gonna start with the most recent dream first, or most recent nightmare first. This summer, I've been doing quite a bit of shadow work. Part of the reason I've not been uploading is in order to take time and slow down and to notice what is going on and to be, I suppose you could say, receptive. some weeks ago, over a month ago now, I'd have to actually check my grimoire, I had a dream in which I was sitting at my altar. This is the first time I can remember this happening. And it started out as a dream, not as a nightmare, which is often the case with me. I tend to have a lot of interlocking sort of vignette style scenes. There's not always a huge amount of easily spoken narrative often in my dreams. So when that does happen, it's actually like of note. But anyway, I was sitting at my altar trying to focus, as I had been struggling to do recently in waking life at my altar. And I was looking at Yorick, my skull there. And from my perspective sitting at the altar, I panned up to look at herself, my representation of deity above. And as I sat there looking at her, there was a crumbling sound, a kind of a like the rest of the world was completely deadly still, to the point where it was part of what was interfering with my ability to focus in sacred space and sort of enter a little bit more of a contemplative state, which again, as I said, anxiety, things I've been struggling with recently. The world was too quiet, and I was staring at her, and her face wasn't communicating, and I started to hear this kind of sound. And all of a sudden, she just cracked right off the wall, and her face fell forward, boom, with a crash that's a lot heavier. Like, she's made out of like various forms of like paper. The artist who made her, you know, like she crashed forward onto the altar, shattering things, dust everywhere that hadn't been there before. And she was like rotten and covered in cobwebs and all of these things. It was as if it was unbelievably all-encompassing, and the manner in which it happened was so instantaneous. I heard the slight cracking sound, and just within seconds that seemed to also encompass worlds, her face just went and crashed onto the altar, destroying the whole thing. And I couldn't even pick her up properly. I was too clumsy. Like, you know, in your dreams, you're already, you know, depending on the type of dream, you're going to have a hard time like touching things or reaching for things, and I couldn't fix it. And I remember trying to fix it, and it was, I woke up abjectly terrified. And I thought about it a lot the next day. And I had been feeling a really intense disconnect and a really intense sort of lack of personal responsibility, if you want to call it that. I don't mean responsibility in terms of things like chores, but more like personal forms of honesty. And we all know that feeling of when connection with deity seems to be diminishing, or we're feeling a little bit disconnected just about many things in general, and it's harder to focus, and you feel less special or less sacred or less magical or whatever it is. We know those sorts of lulls. But this felt like I was being called out. This felt the closest to a warning or a reprimand I've ever had. I still don't think of deity in those terms. It is not an instructional thing, but there are times of very strong recommendation or a proceed with care. And after that dream, I actually like had to think through various other dreams I had had. I had to calm myself the next day. I had to start to prioritize better. Like, it felt like, if you want to put it in perhaps somewhat more sort of popular terms, it felt like a call to shadow work, but it also felt like a call to like, hey, reorient. Your sense of devotion is slipping. Not in a high standards kind of way, just in a personal needs, personal honesty, fluidity kind of way. And although, again, a lot of my nightmares end up being really welcome once I've processed them, I'm glad they happened. It was genuinely like, I was very disconcerted. It doesn't sound that spooky per se, except that of course it had that kind of almost cinematic quality of like, you're looking and you just, very simple scene, you think there's nothing wrong until all of a sudden something very strange is in the air. And most of this dream was permeated by that. I have therefore been taking time away from the internet. I have been focusing on reading because I have articles and things I want to explore from a research perspective. I want to build up my sense of attention span. I've been doing a lot of those things that I've wanted to do for a long time, and I am trying to do so in a way that is slower and more sustainable, and at least in terms of how I currently see the world, as authentic and with as much integrity as possible. I will therefore also indicate, although I don't want to go into detail because it is so sacred that it's quite private, because I was less online, I had a really important personal experience, not just from a Gnostic, in the head perspective. It was a real experience. My partner was with me, that involved my first sighting of a live wild raven up close. My first ever up close sighting in the local area where I live. And I had been seeing signs of that being a potential possibility increasing in the last year or so. I had first heard raven calls in this area over a year ago, but and the occasional report that ravens were kind of re-entering cityscapes in this area, but I would not have had that experience had I not been really working very hard, and actually on that day almost overboard, to shut off my devices and go out and take care of myself and experience the world. I was internet free that entire weekend, and that would not have happened, nor would it have happened in the way that it happened if I had not been really working quite hard to pay attention. And I don't want to say it's fear that motivates that, because I think my understanding of fear as someone who experiences constant nightmares might be a slightly different word in terms of meaning than other people would hear it, if you know what I mean. Like, it's hard for me to find a word that's a more close translation of what I mean, but it's like a form of sacred terror. I wonder if you have to kind of be someone who engages with the Morrígan to know what I'm talking about. Let me know in the comments.
Good morning, everybody. So technical difficulties continued yesterday, and so here I am in the morning with a camera in my face trying to record. So pardon the appearance. I'm literally like in pajamas. I put a ring on to kind of look semi-presentable. But it's 6:30 in the morning. I've already been up for an hour, and this is still the state I'm in. But I figured it would be useful for me to just get this done before I forget everything that I was saying, and so on and so forth. I'm also really sniffly because I sometimes get sneezy in the morning, so hopefully no sneezes. Okay, so I wanted therefore to talk about the next dream. And the way in which this ties in specifically more to Morrígan-based thinking or devotional practice is twofold. Basically, when I have certain types of nightmares, especially the night terrors, the ones where I wake up like genuinely not able to kind of extricate myself, and things like that, there's like a difference between waking up and just being like, whoa, that was scary, I'm awake now, whatever. But then there are the ones where I wake up and I know I'm not all the way awake. I can have full conversations, I can see things, I can go splash my face with water, and I know I haven't left. It feels like genuinely scary, kind of altered neurological state. I haven't had these as much recently. And part of how I deal with that when that happens is if I know that the second I even begin to close my eyes, whether I'm lying down or not, I will be re-entering the dream. I have a sort of specific prayer that I say to the Morrígan that basically says, the meaning in it is that, like, if I have to enter back into that space, if I have to go back into this nightmare or back into these sort of horrific dreams, let it be for something. Let it not be in vain. Let it teach me something, show me something, let it be useful. And it kind of, reconfigures these sorts of things to be more of a form of like creative thinking, and also just gives me a little bit of a sensation of like being able to face going back to sleep, because sleep is obviously important. So there are certain types of nightmares that are much more likely to evoke this response in me should I wake up from them. And furthermore, with this one, it has religious symbolism that ties into, for me, certain things to do with medieval ideology and visual symbolism. And things like death and death positivity, understandings of like mortality, memento mori, but then also very specifically certain medieval associations with ravens and gallows and corpses and things. So, fair warning, this stream is very Francis Bacon, or very Beksiński. This is what I mean, by the way, when I say I look at like strange, creepy art and it doesn't really scare me. It makes me feel seen. I won't claim to necessarily understand the workings of a given artist's mind, but I think the value of art is when you look at it and there's something for you to connect with, whether that's a personal connection or a more collective one. It's communicating something and you're having a response. So there's a dialogue happening. For those of us who, you know, use the energetic model, you could even call it an energetic interchange. That's not quite how I think of it, but, you know, various forms of usability in that regard, or merit. So Francis Bacon and Beksiński, especially with the emphasis on like stretching, screaming faces and all that kind of thing, or like arching rib cages and skeletal formations, and yeah. So again, if you're squeamish, now's the time to click away. So anyway, in this stream, I was wandering a cityscape at night. Very much how a lot of my dreams start, including the anxiety ones, so nothing remarkable yet. But this nighttime was nearing dawn. There was the first burgeoning of that kind of almost theosophical blue in the air. This is a time of day that I spend a lot of my waking life in, especially when it's not summer. And as I was wandering through this city, it was very much along the lines of like New York City, grid plans, high-rise buildings, very, very glass sheen kind of surfaces, highly geometric, almost to the point of being dystopian. Here's where you might see some of the Beksiński type imagery. I had actually, at the time of having this dream, I was less familiar with Beksiński's work. It's possible I may have seen it and so on, but certainly once I did look into it a bit more, purposefully, I was like, oh. So anyway, wandering through this city, and I realized it was utterly silent. It was also icicle cold. It was freezing, but in that fresh morning kind of, it'll kill you, but it feels good kind of cold. It felt cleansing, I suppose, except that the city was silent and there was absolutely no one. Silent in a way that only a city should never be. Nobody around. And I was wandering the streets, looking up at all the buildings, turning certain corners and so on. And eventually I came to a main kind of thoroughfare, comparable in width to, say, something like Fifth Avenue. Very much like slicing through the city. And so I followed it, and I followed it to the outskirts of the city, where I could see in the distance a kind of an open field. Everything kind of dusted over with ice and cold. And as I approached, I could see in the distance kind of three structures at the end of the road. And just as the city limits officially ended, all the buildings ended, those three things turned out to be crucifixes, or rather not in the shape of crucifixes, but gallows. So like one half of the tree shape, but without the hangman's knot portion of the gallows. So like a scaffolding structure associated with execution. There were three main ones, but there were kind of other ones dotting the distance and so on. So this is very much that kind of biblical scenery of like executioner's hill kind of scenario. And as I neared the three main ones up front, the bodies that were on them were still alive, and the manner in which they were hung was arched backwards, like I could see them from profile, arched backwards and hung by their skin, stretching away from their rib cage. So if I give you like a basic understanding, like if this is their rib cage with the ribs splaying outward accordion style, really impossible arch, like almost like a question mark shape of the body with the legs hanging down. So if the legs are proceeding up this way, an arch like that. And then the skin is what was suspending them. They were suspended from their skin. And so what this meant was none of the skin was torn. It had been hung in such a way that it almost evoked like a manuscript page being prepared, a piece of vellum, except that it was utterly thin and translucent, such that the wintry rising sun, which was rising behind them, was showing through the skin and shining in the most exquisite forms of peach and gold and mauves and little like periwinkle blues and so on, where the veins of the flesh were affecting the color. And it was very much many of the colors associated with the rising sun, with dawn, but filtered through this impossibly thinly stretched human skin. And as I said, the figures hanging in this manner were still alive. I could see, it wasn't the most realistic in a way, because I could see also the kind of shadowed effects of their ribcage from behind the skin, a very sort of rippling of the light in the pattern of an arched ribcage. Again, as I said, almost as if you were bending an accordion, so that there were radial kind of structure behind the look of the skin. And the people were still alive and kind of just like twitching from it. And again, the only element of sound in the entire dream was this kind of like kind of like really, really strange. And again, like a slight kind of twitching to communicate the level of shock from this torturous, clearly not immediately lethal position they were in. And I was standing there, the only person alive and not on these scaffolds in the entire city, in this like ice cold but exquisitely lit rising sun beautiful landscape, looking at these bodies, abjectly terrified. I was so scared, the kind of scared that freezes you to the spot. I've only ever been close to that terrified once in my life, awake, and that was where I was in danger of falling right off the top of a mountain, in the White Mountain Range, in New Hampshire. So where I genuinely got so scared that I froze. And actually in that scenario, I realized that if I didn't move, I would genuinely get stuck in this very, very perilous situation. So I was absolutely frozen to the spot and just, I almost want to say in raptures, but I mean like transfixed through terror, through sensory experience, temperature, color, texture, sound, the lack of sound. The atmosphere of it was overwhelming, is not enough of a word. So I woke up, like in a cold sweat level, woke up absolutely terrified, unbelievably freaked out, but there was a corner of my brain that kind of very quickly went, ooh, cool. So again, that is on purpose. When I have these sorts of experiences, I try really hard to like reframe it as something contextual within my imagination, within, understood symbolism. That's part of the reason art matters to me. And then I work this sort of thing into my religious practice. So I wear a lot of satanic crosses or whatever. I have my main one. I have a lot of demonic imagery based on, in my head anyway, the association is a medieval demonological one. And I also work a lot with, for other reasons as well, but there's a reason some of these things appeal to me. It's multi-layered, but I work a lot with things like sound in terror. I work a lot with things like death positivity, and again, medieval memento mori. And all of these things have something to say to me that I feel is important and that I feel needs to be explored over time, that I feel needs to be synthesized and looked at, even though it's at times like the literal worst. So, okay, that's that dream. And actually, I was telling my sister about it at one point, and she sent me an image, a still, which I won't put on screen in case people get really scared or freaked out or are, you know, in some way sensitive and have been continuing to watch. But she sent me an image still from the TV series, is it Hannibal? Again, I don't watch TV or movies because I'm already not in control when I'm asleep, or less in control. But it was of murder victim on, I believe it was deer antlers or something like that, with crows landing on the body. Again, a very, actually, very Murder of Crows tarot kind of image. And there's a reason this sort of thing is my happy place. So there's that. The working of this into my own personal religious symbolism, my own prayer structures, my own devotional practice, my own way of walking about the landscape. I am someone who frequently finds strange times of day or strange temperatures, very cold temperatures to walk through, like brambly, thicketed areas and so on. I like to physically, in my waking life, take myself into these liminal spaces and explore them. Such that it starts to feel much more like a magical power, a form of potency. Certain places and certain things do recur in my dreams, and I find that the contrast between sleep and waking life is also very interesting, because the sleep nightmarish places, as I think I've already said, are all very, very city-based. And there furthermore is a really interesting component of when I encounter music that touches on this sort of thing. So there's the Johnny Flynn song, I think it's called Hard Road. These sorts of things, these like laughing beneath the moon kind of visuals. There's a song by Emily Portman called, I think it's called Sirens. There's a part of the song that goes, you know, where at night the cities glow with orange light, where we have wheels instead of wings, or things like that. It's like, it changes the danger of the siren to the dangers of city lit streets at night. And it's wonderful. I'm not doing the best job of justifying it at the moment or explaining it, so I might put the audio track over this video at some point so you get a sense of what I'm actually trying to talk about.
And they sing, come closer, love, I'll take you to a place where at night the cities glow with orange light, where we have wheels instead of wings, we have no mouths, but still we sing, we sing. A street light flickers, broken glass turns to glittering diamonds.
Okay, dream number 3 was one of the most unusual dreams I have ever had. It's a bit different in the sense that it is not set in a city space. And there are a few other things about it that are really, really remarkable. Again, this is within the context of my devotional practice with the Morrígan. There are certain nightmares that call me to this in my way of thinking about it, in my imagination. And furthermore, there are very few dreams where the Morrígan shows up explicitly. She can be there in symbolism, she can be there by suggestion, she can be there by like metaphorical associations and so on, but it's very, very rare that she's literally in the dream. I also want to put a slight disclaimer on this dream, because this dream plays or is using the language of not only historical class systems, but also assumptions on current and modern class systems that I personally think it formulated a part of my life at the time that it happened, which was a while ago now, that did change my perspective on a few things and felt very much like I needed to challenge certain baseline assumptions. So I will just say that without kind of going too far into the that aspect of detail, but I just want to put that qualifier on this, that this dream does use certain societal tropes that exist still in Ireland, but that also have a very strong historical basis to them that I think, I've seen evidence even in Cork City of these things being challenged. So I'm hoping that continues, but it's kind of within that frame of reference, I suppose. So in this dream, I was dressed in full Edwardian getup. All the layers, my hair was much longer, and it was very much in that Gibson girl, but not done up, the sort of second wave pre-Raphaelite maybe look, half up and then mostly tumbling down. And again, my hair was a lot longer in the dream. And I was walking away from a town center, I suppose. And I was walking along, I guess what you could call a country lane. And I knew in the dream that what I was doing as I was walking was I was going to go visit the ring fort. That there was a ring fort outside this town, very common in Ireland. And I was going to go visit it, and I was going to go have a look, and I was just going to enjoy a day in the countryside. And as I walked, I was looking at the various, types of grasses and wildflowers by the side of the road, on the edge of the laneway, paying attention to the birds in the hedgerows and all that kind of thing. And as I was walking, I started to see in the distance along this path an old wood. And I knew in the dream, it was part of the baseline knowledge that I had, that the path would go through this sort of smallish, very Irishy looking wood. Again, we're not talking a huge amount of old growth. It was going to go through this wood, and that the wood was part of a slow incline in the landscape, and beyond and off to my left, I suppose. Yeah, my left, up that incline a distance away, sort of on the other side of the wood. You still had to kind of pass through bits of it to get there, but it wasn't like you had to pass through the whole thing. You were kind of cutting a corner of the wood, was the hill on which the ring fort was situated. So I passed into the wood, and I became suddenly very aware that it was incredibly inappropriate for me to be walking by myself. So I was walking through this corner of the wood, and I knew suddenly that I should not have done this, that I was alone, and that this was not wise. When, again, just ahead of me, I could see in a slight clearing to the edge of the path, sort of a campsite ahead of me, and one traveler woman sitting there. For those of you who don't know, the travelers in Ireland are, they're like a, what's the term I want to use? And there has been a long-term form of discrimination and marginalization and forced housing schemes and all sorts of things. Again, I'm not really qualified to talk on these things, but I do want to indicate that that's what traveler means in this scenario, for those who are not familiar. At any rate, I saw a traveler woman up ahead on the path, and it was not clear. Here's where the assumptions come in, and here's where the problematic associations come in. Just as she caught my eye and I could no longer turn around, it became clear that she was some kind of junkie or someone I did not feel immediately comfortable being alone with in the woods. And she saw me and she said, "Oh, hello, come sit down, here, have a beer." She was being perfectly lovely and everything. And so I didn't feel comfortable. Again, this is this sort of caught alone kind of thing. I didn't feel comfortable saying that I needed to leave, and there was this understanding in the dream that you're not leaving, you're not going home. And I had the thought in the dream, because at this point I also didn't know if there were other people around that I just couldn't see. I had the thought in the dream, you're going to be another one of those girls. They're going to find your remains, or maybe they won't at all. You're not going to be found, but you're never going to be seen again. And so I sat down, and to be clear, these disappearance kind of things that happen in Ireland are not associated with travelers. But this is the association that was happening in my dream. Anyway, I sat down at this campfire and she was talking to me and so on. And then she kind of like walked with me up the hill, and the area where I needed to be wasn't actually that far away. So it was like just a few yards, but I had to pass through a certain wooded area to get there. So as we were passing the kind of thicketed area, she started to shapeshift. She became more haggard, more old, more emaciated, but not in an excessively skeletal way. It was more like puckered skin on parts of the body were starting to form either swellings or extreme in-dipping areas, almost like between the teeth and so on. Her eyes sunk into the back of her head as her eye sockets themselves actually kind of widened and grew, so that there was this like stretching open blackness kind of in her eyes as the eyeballs themselves kind of retreated and became really small and strange. And her hair became really, it had previously been in like a slightly light colored blonde ponytail just at the base of her neck. And it kind of became loose and flowing, but like really stringy and long and kind of not quite white, but almost like bone colored, slight yellow cast to it. And her clothing, which had been just sort of like a darkish tracksuit or something along those lines with like a zipper up the front, became a much more sort of like, not black as in goth black, black as in simple working dress kind of black, but again with rags and kind of hanging off her. And she started to reach and paw at me, and at time and saying kind of things and like, come on, let's go, you know, and then like pulling me, like really grabbing me by the arm and pulling quite hard to the point where I could like feel the sensation of her skin kind of gripping mine and pulling painfully on it. Almost like when you do a twisting burn kind of feeling. They're passing the brambles, and I was like, and then at a certain point she changed again as she neared the door. She let go of me, and she stepped through the door, having changed into this unrecognizably haggard-like figure. She stepped through the door and suddenly stood straight upright, with all this thick red hair around her, as is often how the Morrígan is described in the stories. Red-browed, red-haired. On Van Rua. Stepped through the threshold, and very Somnia Tarot-like. I think, for example, the Two of Wands has a similar kind of stone arch. Slightly more structured stone arch. She stepped through this threshold and turned around, now fully robed in a medieval structure, like a medieval kind of shape to her gown. And she said, like she looked at me like this regal but genuinely terrifying figure. Not pretty. Her face was like a bird with a beak kind of coming off it and all this kind of thing. Just like, not like beautiful, but so exquisitely beautiful that it was like again, this sort of like frozen to the spot, totally unable to move kind of feeling. And she turned and she said, "Are you coming?" And I remember thinking, if I go through that door, I will die. The passing of that threshold will kill me, and I won't ever leave the ring fort again. To go through this doorway, this arch, means never to leave the ring fort, and I will be entering the other world, and the other world will be death, and she will kill me. And I had the vague sensation that she might eat me, which is a recurring motif in my devotional practice, being eaten by the goddess. And I went through. I made the decision. I looked at her and I kind of just went like, okay, I just went. And the dream, almost cheesily, I suppose, didn't quite fade to black, but the dream ended as I passed. Like things changed and then the dream stopped. And I knew I was dead. And when I woke up, again, I was so scared. This one was much more decidedly not in the modern day, for example, and so on. And it was just so terrifying. And I woke up, but the next day I was like, okay, that was a keeper. That dream was a keeper. And I was like, this is a thing that means things to me. It was speaking a language that I knew others were speaking around me in terms of cultural events. It was asking me to challenge certain perspectives. Not even perspectives I held at each point along the way. It was almost like some of what the dream was doing was teasing over what I'd been hearing. But I also think, and I suspect those who also work, at least loosely even, with, you know, the literature of the Morrígan and so on, medieval literature, will recognize this sense of like, oh, well, I guess I'm doing this, you know? Technological difficulties notwithstanding, I don't really have a great way to conclude this, except to say that it's an ongoing exploration of what terror means. You know, recurring themes are the sort of bodily possession of things like fear, and I mean possession as in total takeover, but also then in integrating these sorts of things, taking control, taking possession of your fear, owning it. Owning your imagination and the way it works. I've been nightmare prone since I was very, very small. The first full night long interlocking scenes, genuinely terrifying nightmare that I can remember having in great detail was when I was 6 years old. And it did involve things like living in building tenement projects and plague, infectious disease, the effect of bodily difference on the minds of adults and things like that. Like it was a lot. It explains a lot about me, I guess. So again, do I feel that to work with a deity is only to kind of shadow work or explain the workings of the mind? Not really. I definitely come at it from a much more actually pagan belief kind of perspective. I don't like the word belief. I guess understanding, pagan religious understanding perspective. I come at it from a much more numinous perspective. I come at it from a much more animist perspective and a much more literal, not so soft polytheist perspective. And, you know, these recurring themes of the goddess consuming the dead, these themes of sound, you know, recurring wailing screams, the notion of singing voices, the notion of the effect of music on the mind, the body, and the soul, the effect of sounds of pain and terror and torture on the mind, the body, and the soul. This is why I'm not good at watching audiovisual content that has narrative basis to it. Like, I'm terrible at movies. And I need my terror in movie format to be kind of like cloaked in unbelievable levels of cheese. So like my favorite movie of all time is Willow from 1988. Don't talk to me about the new series. I don't want to hear it. But you know, there are really interesting, like that movie was made with Joseph Campbell's monomyth in mind. And aside from what I think of that, there's amazingly strong, diverse female characters. There's the use of sound and screams. Bavmorda, literally making like snorting sounds and then echoing screams over a valley as she transforms an army into pigs, might as well be straight out of a frickin' Irish myth. I mean, probably was lifted from things like Irish and like, say, Welsh mythology or medieval literature. You know, shape-shifting scenes, recurring over and over and over again. Even Mad Mardigan's like ridiculous, like the bit where his pig face shows up and then just starts to morph on screen as he like screams, is very much the sort of place my nightmares are in, except not funny. So it's just that this is all like worked into every component of it. It's also the sort of thing that I don't really get much chance to explore on YouTube. So I wanted to kind of put this here as an installment, as part of an understanding of what else goes on aside from tarot, but also using tarot, as I showed you, like with the Murder of Crows tarot, sometimes the Somnia, but like basically loads of my taste is incredibly macabre, incredibly death-ridden, incredibly disease and rot. I have sacred decay, bursting nests out of baby deer bodies on my wall. Like, it's important to me, but it's hard to express in a publicly consumable format. And it's certainly so frequent that it would be redundant to mention it every time it's relevant. So
Hopefully this absolute mess of a video makes sense, and something of interest comes of it. If not, maybe those of you who like slightly weird imagery are entertained. Who knows? Leave comments. Like, let me know what you think about nightmares. Let me know what you think about inspiration from nightmares or any of the related topics. I would love to hear your thoughts. So hope everyone's doing well, taking care of yourselves to the best of your ability, and being kind. And I'll see you all next time.